On the morning of August 4th, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits was moving quickly around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. It was a Tuesday morning, and the house was filled with the usual sounds of a family getting ready for the day. Her husband, Barry, stood at the kitchen sink, his back to her, methodically washing the last of the breakfast dishes. Charlotte reached past him, opening a cupboard to grab her favorite coffee mug. They were both preparing for busy days. Charlotte was a well-respected administrator for the local school district, and Barry was not only the head of the local National Guard Armory, but also the acting mayor of their small, tight-knit community of about 9,000 people. As Barry finished with the dishes and turned from the sink to go find his briefcase in the dining room, Charlotte was pouring herself a cup of coffee. She reminded him that she had a hair appointment scheduled for later that morning. She also mentioned that she would probably be home later than usual that evening. The reason was a difficult meeting she had with her attorneys that afternoon. You see, Charlotte was unfortunately caught in the middle of a messy legal battle with her own cousin, a man named Wayne. The dispute was over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. Her uncle had passed away and left a significant amount of valuable land directly to Charlotte. But her cousin Wayne felt that he deserved a piece of that land too, and so he was formally contesting the will. Today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their respective lawyers were all supposed to sit down in a room together and try to hash things out once and for all. Barry paused by the doorway and asked Charlotte if she had decided what she was going to say at the meeting, what her position was going to be. Charlotte just shook her head and told him no, that she was still turning it over in her mind. On one hand, she knew she didn't want to just give up the land that her uncle had specifically willed to her. But on the other hand, she was deeply worried about the conflict tearing her family apart over money. It was a heavy weight on her shoulders. Barry walked back over to her and put a gentle hand on her shoulder. He looked her in the eyes and reassured her that whatever happened, whatever she decided, their family would get through it together. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his things, and then he left for work. Once Barry's car had pulled out of the driveway, Charlotte took a deep breath, finished her coffee, and headed upstairs. She walked down the hallway and knocked softly on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. As soon as her knuckles tapped the wood, she heard a low groan from inside the room. Charlotte slowly opened the door and peered inside. She found Kara curled up in bed, looking very tired and pale. Now, Charlotte knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager trying to get out of going to school. Kara was pregnant, and for the past several weeks, she had been dealing with some pretty severe morning sickness. To say Charlotte was not thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant would be an understatement. But it wasn't just the pregnancy itself. More than anything, she was deeply unhappy because she absolutely could not stand Kara's boyfriend, a young man named Dave Reed. In Charlotte's eyes, Dave was nothing but trouble. He drank, he had a history of getting into minor scrapes with the law, and he just wasn't the kind of person Charlotte wanted her daughter to be with. At one point, before Kara had gotten pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had actually forbidden her from seeing Dave at all. They had laid down the law and said the relationship was over. But, like many teenagers, Kara hadn't listened. She and Dave had continued to see each other in secret, and now here they were, expecting a baby. Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment in her daughter's choices. But she was also a mother, and she knew that Kara was going to need a lot of support, not just to finish her senior year of high school, but to navigate the incredible challenge of being a teen mom. So, for the time being, Charlotte was trying her best to just keep the peace within the family. With that in mind, she stepped fully into the bedroom and softly asked Kara how she was feeling. Kara just kind of shrugged from under her blankets and said she was okay, just feeling a little nauseous again. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded. She spent a moment tidying up some clothes in the room, and then she reminded Kara that her older sister Heather was coming home from college that night. She told Kara it would be really nice if they could all have dinner together as a family. Kara said that she had a babysitting job that would take up most of her day, but she promised she would be home in time for dinner. Charlotte was pleased to hear that. She told Kara she would see her later that night, said she loved her, and then explained that she had to get going to work. Charlotte left the bedroom, went back downstairs, grabbed her purse from the kitchen counter, and headed out through the garage to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30, Charlotte was driving back down her quiet, tree-lined residential street toward her house. She lived in a very respectable, upper-middle-class neighborhood where pretty much all the neighbors knew each other by name. Historically, crime in the area had been extremely low, almost non-existent. Although more recently, there had been a small string of daytime robberies in the area, which had put some of the residents on edge. But for the most part, Charlotte and her family always felt very safe in their home. Charlotte was having a particularly hectic day. Her morning at the school district office had been incredibly busy, packed with meetings and paperwork. From there, she had driven straight to the salon for her scheduled haircut. And in just a little while, she had to be back at her office for a few more hours of work before her big, stressful afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. The thing was, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked immediately after leaving the salon. She always felt it was a bit too styled, a bit too perfect. So, her plan was to make a quick stop at her house to restyle it herself before she headed back to work to finish out her day. She pulled her car into the garage, shut off the engine, and ran inside the house. She went straight upstairs to the master bathroom. As she was standing in front of the mirror, plugging in her blow-dryer, she heard a distinct sound from downstairs. It was the sound of a door opening. The sound surprised her because she knew she was supposed to be alone in the house. She had assumed Kara was already off at her babysitting job, and her husband, Barry, almost never came home for his lunch break. Confused, she set the blow-dryer down on the counter and walked out of the bathroom to go and see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter, Heather, pulled her car up to the house. She had just arrived from her college, which was located a few towns away, and she was really excited to see her parents and her sister when they all got home from work that evening. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something that struck her as a little odd. She saw that the main garage door was wide open, and her mom's car was parked inside. This surprised her because when she had talked to her mom on the phone just the day before, Charlotte had specifically said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6 o'clock because of her late meeting. Heather didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe the meeting got canceled, she thought. So she just grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of big grocery bags filled with her belongings out of the back seat of her car. As she walked into the open garage to make her way into the house, she noticed something else that was strange. The interior door that led from the garage into the kitchen was already open, but just a crack. This was definitely unusual. There was no real reason for that door to be left ajar. And now, a small feeling of unease began to creep in. Sensing that maybe something was off, Heather walked up to the door and slowly pushed it open the rest of the way. She called out, "Mom!" wanting to see what she was doing. But there was no answer. The house was silent, so Heather stepped into the quiet kitchen and set down her hamper and the bags on the floor. Then she began to walk through the first floor of the house looking for her mom. She didn't hear her and she couldn't see her anywhere. She was just walking from room to room calling out her mom's name. And then, as she rounded the corner into the main foyer, she saw her. Her mom was lying at the foot of the main staircase, completely still and motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom's side, dropping to her knees and grabbing her, trying to see if she was okay. But when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold. A wave of panic washed over her. She scrambled back to her feet, ran into the other room, snatched the phone from its cradle, and frantically dialed 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department was speeding down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and his siren blaring. He was responding to the 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. He had been very surprised when the dispatcher had told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's acting mayor, Barry Waits. As he pulled his patrol car up in front of the home, he saw a young woman come running out of the front door, crying hysterically. Lieutenant Carter quickly stopped his car, got out, and intercepted the young woman, who he would soon learn was Heather. She begged him to come inside and help her mom. So, Carter and the young woman rushed over to the house together. As they reached the front porch, he gently told her to stay outside while he went in to investigate. She complied, staying out on the front lawn, quietly weeping to herself while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door. And right away, just inside the foyer, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a grand staircase. She was completely motionless. Nearby, the contents of a purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down beside the woman and felt for a pulse on her neck, but there was nothing. Carter stood back up and began to assess the scene more carefully. The first thing he noticed was a bit of foam at the corner of the woman's mouth. His initial thought was that maybe she had suffered a seizure or some kind of sudden severe allergic reaction at the top of the stairs, lost her balance, and tragically fallen down. The fall could have killed her. But then he also noticed that there were a few distinct drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he saw what were clearly scratch marks on her chin. He also saw a dark, angry-looking red mark around her neck, and in that moment, he realized this woman had not just fallen down the stairs. It was very likely she had been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled to death. Later that day, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Richard Carter was carefully sorting through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits's laundry room. For the past half an hour, he had been methodically scouring the entire house, which was now an active crime scene, looking for any possible clues. And now, he was holding 2 white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots that looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and instructed him to take the towels into evidence. He couldn't be sure yet if the blood was even Charlotte's, but if it was, it could be a very important clue. After searching the whole house from top to bottom, Carter had developed a pretty strong working theory about what had happened to Charlotte. He had found no signs of forced entry anywhere, and all the obvious valuables, like the television and other electronics, were still in the home. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but her cash and all of her credit cards were still inside her wallet. So Carter did not believe this was a simple robbery gone wrong. He thought that maybe the killer had just dumped out the purse at the end as a weak attempt to make it look like a robbery to throw the police off their trail. This did not seem like a random act of violence. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard a commotion coming from the direction of the front door. So he went to see what was going on. When he got to the foyer, he saw a man out on the doorstep who was literally being physically held back by two forensics officers. And then, after a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside to prevent him from seeing the scene, but Barry was distraught and pushed past them. And as soon as he got inside, he saw what they were trying to shield him from. His wife's body, lying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze in place and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently took Barry by the arm and led him into the adjacent living room. He sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't. Barry was gasping for air, really struggling to breathe. And then he suddenly doubled over and clutched at his chest. For a moment, Carter thought he might be having a heart attack, so instead of trying to talk to him or ask him any questions, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Carter stepped into the brightly lit lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked if he could see Barry Waits. But the nurse informed him that he would have to wait. They were still running tests on Barry, and he couldn't have any visitors until they were absolutely sure that he was stable. Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this, not because he was desperate to get in there and console the mayor, but because he really needed to talk to him. This was the spouse of a potential murder victim. He needed to know what Barry knew, what he had seen, and what his day had been like. So, he turned to leave, but before he did, he noticed two young women sitting in the waiting room. He recognized one of them as Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather. Carter and Heather had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day, when Heather was the one who had come running out and directed him into the house. They had talked a little bit, but she had been too upset to provide much information. Carter thought to himself, you know what, if I can't talk to Barry, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough now that we can have a real conversation. And so he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up and she definitely recognized who he was. She sort of gave off body language that indicated it was okay for him to come and sit down. So Carter walked over and sat down in the chair next to her. He saw that there was another girl, a teenager, sitting on the other side of Heather. Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said that this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara, and then he asked both women how their dad was doing. Heather explained that the doctors so far believed he had not had a heart attack. They thought it was likely a severe panic attack, but they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed incredibly upset. They had tears in their eyes, and they both appeared to be in a state of shock. They hadn't done anything suspicious, really. But Carter knew that he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his small notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them what they knew. By this point, Carter's officers had already done some preliminary work. They had learned that Charlotte had left her office around 11 in the morning that day. It wasn't until about 1 in the afternoon that her concerned co-workers had called her house because she hadn't come back to work. They said that there was no answer when they called, and so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime within that 2-hour window between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. So, with that in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they had been that morning and afternoon, with a specific focus on that 11 to 1 time frame. Kara told him that she had been babysitting all day for a family on the other side of town, and Heather said that she had been at her college, which was a good 30 miles away, until around 4 o'clock that afternoon, which was when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother, or who might have wanted to hurt her, or who might have been happy if something bad happened to her. And the girls immediately shook their heads and said, absolutely not. There was no one. They insisted their mom was a wonderful person, that everybody seemed to like her, and that they were a happy, normal family. They said there were no major issues that they knew of. Carter jotted all of this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughter's alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct debriefing with the other investigators who were assigned to Charlotte's case. He had listened to the local news on the radio while driving to work that morning, and since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was the only thing anybody in town could talk about. So Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case, and to solve it quickly, by this point he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out completely. Neither of the daughters could have possibly been at the house between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects, and so now the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned all of Charlotte's neighbors and coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, that none of those interviews had led to any new suspects. Another point of frustration was that the one person who would likely be able to help them the most, at least at this point in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband. But he was still in the hospital and was therefore not being allowed to speak to the police. But just as Carter and the others were sort of scratching their heads, wondering what their next move was going to be, the front door of the precinct opened. And who walked in but Barry Waits himself. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting across from each other in Carter's small office. Barry said that he had just been released from the hospital. The doctors had determined that his heart was fine and that he really had just suffered from a severe panic attack. He said that as soon as he was out of the hospital, he had come right over to the station to see what he could do to help with the investigation. And so Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day that Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say that he left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop had been closed, so he had just gone right back to work. He said he had stayed there until around 4:30, which was when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter, Heather, telling him that their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter was actually primarily just looking at Barry's hands and arms. He was looking to see if there were any scratches or cuts or bruises. The running theory, based on the evidence they had seen at the crime scene, was that Charlotte had put up a significant fight against her attacker before she was killed. And so, presumably, there should be defensive wounds of some kind on the attacker, most likely on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, there were no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple. He seemed very earnest about it and genuinely eager to help. And so, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was telling the truth and that he was not a suspect. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was a grieving husband telling the truth. At some point, Carter kind of shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea about who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said yes, he did. He said there were actually two people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He said the first person was a guy named Dave Reed, who was actually their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He explained that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was kind of a bad influence, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually, Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. And so Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over the house to confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things had just gotten out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem for Charlotte. And that's when Barry brought up the inheritance dispute. He explained that his wife and her cousin Wayne were in the middle of this very contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys on the very same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up straight in his chair because he thought to himself that the timing here could not possibly be a coincidence. The cousin Wayne was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had immediately responded by saying he would not say a single word without his lawyer present. And this had made Carter pretty suspicious because during that very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he pretty much leaned right in and began to grill Wayne. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said that he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family, but he swore that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. In fact, he claimed she had been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that, and Wayne said that the last time he had spoken to Charlotte, she had seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had told him that she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all of the land for herself just wasn't worth the conflict. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised. because Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option on the table. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he had literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch, which was something he typically did. He insisted he was at work truly all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. Wayne immediately looked over at his attorney. His attorney gave him a slight nod, and so Wayne looked back at Carter and said, "Okay." Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish, and he just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there at the station. When Carter asked him if he knew why he'd been called in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, "Yeah, I do." He had heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew that, given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was completely absurd. And so Carter actually just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. And Dave would admit that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him, but Dave insisted that he would never hurt Charlotte, or Barry for that matter. He also said he hadn't even been in town on the day that she was killed. He had been at work all day at a landscaping job miles and miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints, to which Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You're wasting your time." But he said he would do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk, flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And as he read, he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had initially thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the long, decorative strings that dangled from her neckline and had used them to strangle her to death. She had also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist from the struggle. Now, this level of extreme violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the other evidence seemed to paint a different picture entirely. There were 3 sets of fingerprints that had been found at the crime scene. 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise at all because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was actually unidentified, and it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So, at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. To make matters worse, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well. So, truly, his list of potential suspects was basically down to 0. So if Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was still the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him that they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt a familiar dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this dedicated tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls, basically every single day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down to a crawl. Carter and his team had to take valuable time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just baseless rumors and wild conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they had looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but it turned out he had an airtight alibi. They had also investigated another local man who had once strangled his girlfriend in a manner that was eerily similar to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had a solid alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to the neighboring state of Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had been bragging at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out that this small-time criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get the guy in trouble. Also, in addition to all these new potential suspects having alibis, none of their prints matched the unidentified prints that had been found at the crime scene. And to add even more confusion to this, a fingerprint expert had told Carter that it was actually possible that those 3rd prints could belong to a child. And so maybe they were totally unrelated to the murder altogether. And so now, as Carter looked over at this desk sergeant, who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just taken, Carter just braced himself for more bad news because all these tip line calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was indeed more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress in the case, and as difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to all the pressure he was already feeling, that local residents were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, it was a low blow. But Carter also understood their frustration, because he was actually feeling just as upset and helpless as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends, he was completely out of ideas. And he had a sinking feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold, fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this particular day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial massive wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the case had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to try and move on with their lives without any sort of closure. Cara had her baby, and Heather had graduated from college and was working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much involved in local politics. And in fact, just the previous year, he had run for a term on the city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife, Charlotte. And even though this opponent had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the bizarre fact that he claimed to have had a dream about it, all the media attention from these wild accusations had totally reinvigorated the case. And so, calls had once again begun flowing into this tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these new tips were just more wild theories and local gossip. But that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up the door to Carter's office, Carter looked up and saw that the sergeant was visibly excited. Like whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him what he had heard, the desk sergeant said that he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real, concrete information that they wanted to share. Information that he said was going to blow this case wide open based on that crucial tip, as well as forensic evidence and witness testimony. This is what police now believe happened to Charlotte Waits on August 4th, 1998. Around 11:30 in the morning, the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house, and right away, they recognized Charlotte's car parked in the open garage. And when they saw it, their heart raced with a dark excitement because they hadn't been sure that she would even be home. But clearly, the killer had gotten here at exactly the right time. So they parked their car at the end of the driveway, they got out, and they walked up into the garage. They walked over to the interior door that led into the house, and they tried the handle, and they found that it was unlocked. So they opened it up, the killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away they heard footsteps on the second floor. They knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home at this time of day. So the killer closed the door behind them, they went around to the main staircase that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them, and Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them standing there in her house in the middle of a weekday. But the killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not the answer the killer wanted to hear, and so the killer tried to get her to change her mind to answer this question differently. But the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument, and then the killer just totally lost their temper and struck Charlotte hard across the face. Blood immediately began pouring out of Charlotte's nose, and stunned, she just kind of stumbled back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with. Now, at this point, the killer knew that they had crossed a line, and so persuading Charlotte to do what they wanted was clearly out of the question. This was a point of no return. So, as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with a white towel pressed to her face, looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind. They clutched the long strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. And so, Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, scratching and clawing, but the killer absolutely had her in this chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her with all their might down the long staircase. And when the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte lying in a heap at the base of the stairs, obviously motionless and very likely dead, the terrible reality of what they had just done, it hit them. And so, in a blind panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped on the floor upstairs. They rushed down the stairs and they quickly cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, trying to erase any evidence of the initial struggle. Then they ran into the laundry room and dumped the bloody towels in with the other dirty laundry. Then they went back and grabbed Charlotte's purse off the nearby table and scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping that the police would think that this was just a random robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed that they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's acting mayor, and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. It turned out that Barry had secretly gotten himself into a lot of debt, and he desperately needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it all off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and confronted Charlotte, asking her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and to split the inheritance with her cousin to keep peace in the family. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped, and he killed his wife. It wasn't just because he was angry at her for her decision. It was also because he needed more money. He was thinking, okay, I'm only going to get half of this inheritance because she's giving the other half to Wayne, but if I kill her, I'll also get her life insurance policy. And then between the two, I'll have more than enough money to pay off all of my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim on Charlotte's life insurance policy, because Barry was so early on in the investigation, clearly a suspect in his wife's murder, the company refused to pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money directly to their two daughters, Heather and Cara. But a couple of years later, Barry, still desperate for money, tried to get his hands on it by tricking his own daughters into signing the money over to him. But when Heather and Cara realized what their father was trying to do, they finally saw him for what he truly was. And so it was the daughters, who were the tipsters, who finally broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior around the time of the murder, along with his clear financial motives. They also told him that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police, and that he had even called in fake tips himself to try and redirect the investigation away from him. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The two daughters, Heather and Cara, had to make the unimaginable choice to turn in their own father, all to get justice for the mother that he had stolen from them. They lost both of their parents on that terrible day in August, one to violence, and the other to his own greed and deception. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. one afternoon in the spring of 1990, a young mother tidied up her family's living room in Pingyang Township. This was a small, quiet, rural community made up of several quiet villages in southern China. The day was very peaceful, and the mother was almost done with her daily chores. She had spent the morning sweeping the stone floors, dusting the simple wooden furniture, and washing clothes by hand in a large basin. She was looking forward to a quiet afternoon, but just as she was putting away her cleaning cloths, she heard her 3-year-old twin daughters start to cry. This really caught her off guard. Even though these kids were only 3 years old and 3-year-olds are known to cry a lot, her daughters basically never cried. They were like silent all the time. The girls' names were Shai and Xiongwu. Since the day they were born, they had been incredibly easy babies. They never fussed, they never threw tantrums, and they basically just wanted to sleep or lay around quietly. It was like they were living in their own quiet world. At first, the mother felt very lucky to have such calm, peaceful babies. But as the girls got older, their silence became more and more concerning to the family. They were 3 years old now, and they had not even said their very first words yet. They did not even make normal baby babbling noises. They just spent most of their days laying in their cribs, staring at the ceiling, or sleeping for hours on end. The mother had started to worry that something might be deeply wrong with them, but in this rural area, specialized medical care was far away and very expensive. So she had just been hoping they would eventually grow out of it and start behaving like normal children. So when the mother suddenly heard these girls crying hysterically from their nursery, she rushed down the hallway. She wanted to see what was going on. On one hand, she wanted to make sure her kids were physically okay. On the other hand, she was incredibly curious. This was so uncharacteristic for them. They had never made this much noise in their entire lives. The mother burst into the nursery and saw her girls in their crib. They were sobbing hysterically, totally upset, and clinging to one another. The mother rushed over and scooped them up in her arms. She asked them what was going on, and she tried to comfort them, asking if they were okay or if they had a bad dream. But of course, the girls did not say anything back to her. They did not speak. They just continued to cry and sob against her shoulder. The mother carefully assessed her kids. She looked at their arms, their legs, and their faces. She could not see any physical injuries. They did not seem sick, and they did not have a fever. They were just deeply, deeply upset about something, but the mother had absolutely no idea what it could be. So she just stood there in the quiet nursery, rocking them back and forth, and whispering gentle words to comfort them. Eventually, the girls began to calm down. Their breathing slowed, their tears dried up, and they drifted back into their usual deep sleep. The mother gently placed them back into their crib, pulled the blanket over them, and walked out of the room, feeling very confused by the whole situation. A couple of days later, the twin girls were right back to their normal routine. They were totally silent, and they spent most of the day sleeping in their nursery. The mother went about her usual housework, trying to keep herself busy. At some point, she walked down the hallway past the girls' closed bedroom door. She had not heard a single peep from them all day. They had been sleeping quietly for hours. But as the mother walked past the door, she suddenly came to an abrupt stop. She stood frozen in the middle of the hallway. She listened closely because she could distinctly hear her girls making noise inside their room. But the noise they were making did not make any sense to her. Her daughters were not crying, they were not fussing, and they were not whining. They were talking at first. The mother wanted to rush right into the room. She wanted to experience this firsthand, to witness this amazing landmark moment of her daughters speaking their very first words. But then she stopped herself. She worried that if she suddenly burst through the door, she might startle them, and they would immediately go silent again. She did not want to ruin the moment. So, instead of opening the door, she stepped closer, pressed her ear flat against the wooden door, and just listened. As she listened, she really could not believe what she was hearing. These girls were not just babbling random baby words. They were not pointing at things and saying simple names. These girls were having a full-blown, mature, adult-level conversation with each other. They were speaking in complete, complex sentences, throwing words back and forth like two grown adults would. The mother stood there, her heart pounding in her chest. These were the same girls who had never said a single word in their 3 years of life. How was this even possible? But the more the mother listened to her daughters, the more unsettled she became. It was not just the fact that her toddlers were suddenly speaking like adults. It was the actual content of the discussion they were having. It made absolutely no sense. Her 3-year-old daughters were talking in deep detail about people, places, and events from a totally different village. It was a village that the mother knew her daughters had never been to in their entire lives. They had never even heard of it, and they certainly did not know anybody who lived there. The girls were talking about specific families, specific names, houses, and very personal stories. Now, in basically any other part of the world, if a mother suddenly heard her 3-year-old twins, who had never said a single word before, suddenly having adult-level conversations with each other about people and places they could not possibly know about, she would probably panic. She would probably call a doctor, a scientist, or a psychologist immediately. But this mother lived in Pingyang Township, and that meant when she heard what her daughters were saying, as alarming as it was, she actually did know what was going on. Pingyang Township has a very strange and unique secret. That secret is that of the approximately 7,000 residents who live in this small rural area, over 100 of them claim to be the reincarnated spirits of people who have died traumatic deaths. And this is not just some wacky thing that a few people say to get attention. In Pingyang Township, it is not just those 100 people who believe they are reincarnated. The entire community, all 7,000 some odd people, 100% believe that these people truly are reincarnated. It is a completely accepted part of their daily life and culture. And so how this actually plays out in real life is very fascinating. Periodically, these reincarnated folks will go up to a non-reincarnated person in the township and make claims based on their past lives. For example, a reincarnated person might approach a neighbor and claim that in their past life, that neighbor's family owed them a large debt. They will ask to be paid back. And the crazy thing is, these non-reincarnated families will actually look through their old records, realize the story matches up, and they will pay the debt without any hesitation. In other cases, there have been physical fights and intense arguments because a reincarnated person approached someone and claimed that in a previous life, that person's relatives had insulted or wronged them. They will demand an apology or a fight right then and there, and the community views this as completely normal and justified. But the interactions between the reincarnated and the non-reincarnated people are not just about conflict and debts. In fact, there have been a lot of major life decisions made in this township designed very specifically to avoid conflict and maintain peace between the residents. For example, there was a little boy in the town who began to claim that he was the reincarnated spirit of a pig. He said he had been raised and eventually butchered in the town. He went as far as to identify the exact local butcher who had slaughtered him when he was a pig. When the local butcher heard about this, he did not get angry or call the boy crazy. Instead, to make sure he was not offending this boy, or potentially offending other residents who might be the reincarnated spirits of other animals he had slaughtered in the past, the butcher made a massive decision. He shut down his entire butchering business. He just said he did not want to cause any offense or bad, and he would find something else to do with his life. So, when this mother stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of her twin girls having this highly detailed, adult-level conversation about people and events from a neighboring village, as shocking as it was, she instantly understood what was happening. Because she lived in Pingyang, she knew the only possible way her girls could have this information and be able to speak so perfectly was if they were reincarnated spirits. So, this mother did what she thought was the right thing to do. She did not call a doctor, and she did not panic. Instead, she decided to get the word out. She began talking to her neighbors, her family, and people throughout the township, letting them know that her twin daughters were actually reincarnated spirits who had finally started speaking. The mother's hope was that perhaps the families of the deceased people her daughters were talking about in their room were still alive. She hoped they would hear about this, recognize the details, and want to come to her home to meet their loved ones who were now living inside the bodies of her young daughters. Sure enough, less than a week after the mother got the word out, a man and a woman she had never seen before came knocking at her front door. They had traveled from the neighboring village. When the mother opened the door and let them inside the house, something incredible happened. The twin girls immediately looked at them and recognized them. One of the twins ran up to the woman and said that this was her mother from her previous life. The other twin ran to the man and identified him. Then, these two little 3-year-old girls sat down and went on to tell an unbelievably complicated and sophisticated story. They explained that in their previous life, they were not actually sisters at all. Instead, they had been best friends who lived in the neighboring village. They had faced very difficult times and intense emotional struggles, and approximately 1 month before they were reborn in the bodies of these twin girls, they had made a tragic pact. They had taken their own lives together. The twins continued to talk to this man and woman for a very long time. They gave highly specific details about the neighboring village, describing the streets, the houses, and the families. Again, these were places these toddlers had never physically been to in their lives. The girls also shared very intimate, private details about the lives of the two teenage girls, things that only the teenagers and their parents would know. They even described exactly what happened to them when they took their own lives, and they gave the exact coordinates and description of where their bodies had been found by the local search parties. At some point during this conversation, the biological mother of the twins turned to the visiting man and woman. She asked them if the details the girls were giving were actually accurate, and if this was all true. The man and woman, who were crying, nodded their heads and said, "Yes, every single detail they are giving is completely true." Then the twins turned to their biological mother. They decided to answer the questions she had been wondering about for years. They told her that the reason they had remained completely silent up to this point was because they were trying very hard to keep their reincarnation a secret. They were afraid of what might happen if people found out. They also explained that the reason they wanted to sleep all the time was because when they slept, they would dream about their previous lives, which they claimed to miss deeply to this day. No one has ever been able to offer a better, more logical explanation for how these two toddler girls had such highly accurate, private, and detailed information about deceased teenagers they had never met and places they had never been to. Basically, the only explanation that works for the people of Pingyang Township is that they must actually be the reincarnated spirits of those teenage girls. To this day, Pingyang Township remains a major hotspot of alleged reincarnations, and nobody really knows why it happens there. Now, we are going to move on to our next story. This next story is going to sound incredibly far-fetched once it gets going, but you have to stick with it. Because by the end of this story, there is an absolutely crazy plot twist. This is truly one of the best historical mysteries we have found in a long time, so definitely stick around until the very end. On a warm spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny, isolated settlement called Eagle Creek, which was located in the rugged territory of Arizona. While Sarah was busy cleaning up the inside of the house, her sister Elizabeth grabbed a heavy wooden bucket and headed outside. She walked down the path to get some fresh water from their outdoor natural spring. Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this small timber farmhouse along with their respective husbands and their children. The American West at this time was an incredibly sparsely populated, wild, and dangerous place. Because of the constant threats from the harsh environment and outlaws, it was not uncommon for families to band together and share a home like this for safety. While the two husbands spent their long days out on the dry range, herding the sheep and working the rugged land, Sarah and Elizabeth stayed back to look after the home and take care of their collective 4 young children. On this particular afternoon, as Elizabeth was outside gathering water, Sarah continued her house chores. She kept one eye on the 4 children who were playing quietly in the main room, making sure they were safe and behaving. But all of a sudden, the quiet afternoon was shattered. The family's large guard dogs, who were leashed up outside near the barn, began to bark incredibly aggressively. For Sarah, this was immediately alarming. The dogs were usually very docile, friendly, and spent most of their days sleeping in the shade. They rarely made any noise at all. So, hearing them bark with such intense fury and fear meant that something was definitely happening out there. Sarah quickly told the children to stay exactly where they were and not to move. She rushed to the front door, opened it, and stepped out onto the wooden porch to see what had set the dogs off. Once she was out on the porch, Sarah immediately began scanning the wild landscape in front of her. To her left and to her right, there was nothing but the usual rocky scrub, dry brush, and dirt. But right in front of the farmhouse, there was a large, steep, sandy hill. This hill was so big that it completely obscured their view of the trail leading off into the distance. Sarah noticed that the dogs, who were pulling hard against their leashes in the front yard, were staring directly at the top of that sandy hill, growling and barking frantically. At first, Sarah could not understand what they were barking at. She stared at the hill, looking for any sign of a coyote, a stray cow, or maybe a traveler, but there was absolutely nothing there. But then, as she continued to watch the top of the hill, she saw something emerge over the crest. A massive, terrifying creature began to slowly make its way down the hill, heading directly toward her house. It was a giant 4-legged beast with thick, matted red fur. Its back was strange and completely twisted up. But what made Sarah's heart stop was what was sitting on the back of this creature. There was a man riding it, but this was not a normal-looking man. As the creature got closer, Sarah could see his face. It was horrific and sunken, with dry skin clinging to the bones. The man's mouth was twisted into a massive, unnatural, toothy grin. And as she stared at his face in total shock and disbelief, she realized that he had no eyes. There were just dark, empty sockets staring back at her. Sarah was a deeply religious woman who spent her evenings reading her Bible by candlelight. As she stood on the porch, watching this massive red beast and its eyeless, grinning rider charge directly toward her, her mind went to the darkest place possible. She became absolutely convinced that she was looking at the literal devil. She believed the devil was riding this red monster of the apocalypse, and he was coming to claim her and her young family. Instinctively, panic took over. Sarah turned around, bolted back inside the farmhouse, and slammed the heavy oak door shut. She quickly dropped the wooden latch into place, and then, using all of her strength, she dragged the heavy wooden kitchen table across the floor and wedged it tightly against the door to barricade it. She then rounded up the 4 terrified children, pulled them into the corner of the kitchen, and huddled over them. She covered their ears and began praying to God at the top of her lungs, begging him to save them from the evil outside. But as she was praying, a sound cut through the air. It was a loud, blood-curdling scream coming from somewhere outside. Sarah froze. She knew that scream. It was far too human to be coming from the devil or the red creature. It was the sound of a woman in absolute terror. Sarah instantly realized that the scream was coming from her sister, Elizabeth, who was still out by the water spring. But Sarah was so paralyzed by her own fear, and she felt such a deep responsibility to protect the 4 young children huddled beneath her, that she simply could not bring herself to move. She could not leave the safety of the barricaded house. So, instead of running outside to try and save her sister, she just squeezed the children tighter, closed her eyes, and continued to pray. She hoped and prayed that Elizabeth would somehow survive whatever was happening outside. Hours passed. Sarah remained huddled in the corner of the barricaded kitchen, holding the children and listening to the silence. Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not returned to the house. Sarah felt an immense weight of guilt and horror. She wanted desperately to go out and look for her sister, but she was still too terrified of the grinning devil that she believed was waiting for her in the shadows. But just then, she heard the sound of heavy footsteps walking onto the wooden porch. Then, she heard the front doorknob turn. The door rattled as someone pushed hard against it, but the heavy kitchen table held the door firmly in place. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. She thought the devil had finally come back to get them. She and the children began to scream in terror. But then, through the thick wooden door, Sarah heard the sound of two very familiar voices calling out. It was the voices of her husband and Elizabeth's husband. They had finally returned from their long day of herding sheep, and they were confused as to why the house was completely locked up. They called out, asking what was going on and demanding to be let inside. A massive wave of relief washed over Sarah. She rushed to the door, shoved the heavy kitchen table out of the way, threw open the latch, and flung the door wide. She immediately burst into tears, sobbing hysterically. She began babbling about the red beast, the grinning devil with no eyes, and the horrible screams she had heard hours ago. She told them that Elizabeth had gone to the spring to get water and had never returned. The two husbands were instantly incredibly concerned. They had no idea what to make of Sarah's wild story about the devil, but they knew that Elizabeth was missing, and that was a very real danger. The men did not hesitate. They grabbed their rifles, lit their lanterns, and headed out into the growing darkness toward the outdoor spring to find Elizabeth. The two men made their way down the dirt path, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows across the rocks. At first, they walked quickly, calling out Elizabeth's name into the quiet night. But when they got no response, their worry turned into panic, and they broke into a full run. As they rounded the corner and arrived at the natural spring, they stopped. There, lying face down in the wet mud, was Elizabeth. There was blood all around her, and she was completely motionless. Elizabeth's husband rushed over and collapsed beside her, weeping over her body. But it was too late. Elizabeth was dead. While Elizabeth's husband mourned, Sarah's husband rode his horse at a gallop into the nearest town to fetch the local coroner so they could find out what had happened to her. To the two husbands, the cause of death seemed fairly obvious. There were massive, deep animal tracks and hoof prints pressed into the mud all around Elizabeth's body. It looked like she had been violently trampled to death. The coroner eventually arrived at the scene and began his investigation. He looked at Elizabeth's body and agreed that her injuries were consistent with being trampled by a massive animal. However, when he got down on his hands and knees to examine the hoof prints in the mud, he ran into a major problem. These prints were absolutely massive. They were far too large and the wrong shape to be the prints of a horse, a mule, or an ox. The coroner literally told the family that he could not say she was killed by a horse because whatever animal made these tracks was something completely different. The coroner then spoke with Sarah to get her statement. Sarah described the entire event in detail. She told him about the massive red creature that came over the hill and the terrifying, eyeless, grinning man riding on its back. She insisted that the devil himself had trampled her sister to death. Now, the coroner agreed that Elizabeth had likely been trampled by a giant, powerful beast. But he absolutely did not believe the supernatural details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the literal devil was riding a monster through the Arizona desert, but because he could not identify the animal tracks, and he could not find any other logical explanation, the coroner ultimately decided to list Elizabeth's official cause of death as unknown, but the coroner's doubts did not stop the rumors from spreading. Word of the incident quickly traveled from ranch to ranch, saloon to saloon, across the entire Arizona frontier. Before long, basically everyone living in the territory had heard the terrifying story of the devil and the red beast. The locals even gave the creature and its rider a nickname. They called them the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard the stories figured it was just a myth. They thought it was an exaggeration, a scary story told around campfires, or just some local lore passed around by superstitious settlers. But over the next few years, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent, and they became much more strange. Campers sleeping deep in the Arizona wilderness began reporting terrifying encounters. They claimed that in the dead of night, a giant red creature would suddenly charge out of the darkness and trample directly over their tents, destroying their gear and scattering their horses into the desert. One group of prospectors claimed they woke up to see a towering figure standing over their campfire, its skeletal face grinning at them in the moonlight before it vanished into the brush. One day, a brave cowboy actually managed to get close to the creature. He was riding his horse through a rocky canyon when he spotted the red ghost grazing on some dry brush. Hoping to capture the beast and solve the mystery, the cowboy readied his lasso. He rode up close, swung his rope, and successfully threw it around the creature's neck. But the red ghost did not react like a normal wild horse. It let out a deep, terrifying roar, turned and bolted with incredible speed and power. The force was so immense that the cowboy's horse was nearly pulled off its feet, and the cowboy himself was dragged from his saddle. He was scraped and bruised against the rocks, and he had to quickly let go of the rope to save his own life. The red ghost disappeared into the desert, still wearing the cowboy's rope. Stories like this continued for an entire decade. The legend of the red ghost grew larger and larger until one morning in 1893. A farmer named Harrison, who lived in eastern Arizona, happened to look out his window early in the morning. He was checking on his crops, and there, standing right in the middle of his turnip patch, was the red ghost. Harrison had heard all the rumors and stories about the red ghost over the years. He had already made up his mind about exactly what he would do if he ever came face to face with the legendary monster. He was going to shoot it. Harrison did not hesitate. He quietly grabbed his loaded Winchester rifle, walked over to the window, and aimed it right at the beast. He took a deep breath, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The loud gunshot echoed across the valley, and the red ghost collapsed to the ground, falling right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once he was sure the creature was down and no longer moving, Harrison ran outside. He hurried over to the turnip patch, eager to finally see what the heck this monster actually was. He wanted to see what had been terrorizing the Arizona territory for the last 10 years. But when he got to the carcass and looked down, he realized that all of the supernatural stories and legends had been completely wrong. It turned out that the red ghost was not some mythical monster from another world. Instead, it was a combination of two very real, very mortal beings. The first of these beings was a creature that if you saw it today, you would recognize it instantly. But for the average settler living in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have had absolutely no way of knowing what it was, because they had never seen one before. The beast had thick red fur, a long neck, and a large humped back. It was a camel. It turns out that back in the 1850s, a man named Jefferson Davis, who was the United States Secretary of War at the time, decided to launch a unique military experiment. He believed that camels would be much better suited for hauling heavy military supplies through the dry, arid deserts of the American Southwest than horses or mules. So the military imported dozens of camels from the Mediterranean and created what was known as the U.S. Camel Corps. The experiment was actually quite successful at first, but when the American Civil War broke out, the military abandoned the project. Many of the camels were sold off, but several of them either escaped or were simply released into the wild. These camels managed to survive, adapt, and roam freely through the harsh deserts of Arizona. This explained the giant red beast, and it also explained the massive, soft, two-toed hoofprints that had baffled the coroner at the scene of Elizabeth's death. But the camel alone was not what had terrified the settlers of Arizona and created the legend of the red ghost. What really created the terrifying legend was the rider. When Sarah had looked out from her porch 10 years prior, she had seen a rider on the camel's back. She had seen a face with no eyes and a massive, terrifying, toothy grin, and she believed it was the devil. But she was actually right about one thing. It was a human being. The rider of the camel was a real man. But he was not riding the camel willingly. He was a decomposing human corpse. It turned out that at some point, many years prior, this man had been placed on the camel's back. His body had been incredibly tightly bound and lashed to the heavy wooden saddle using thick leather thongs and ropes. We do not know who this man was, and we do not know how he died. Some historians believe he may have been a soldier, a prospector, or a traveler who had been captured by bandits or hostile forces, and he had been tied to the wild camel as a form of execution or torture, and then the beast was set loose in the desert. Because the leather ropes were wrapped so tightly around his arms, legs, and torso, when the man eventually died, his body did not fall off. He remained held in an upright, seated position on the camel's back. As the camel wandered the desert for years, searching for food and water, the hot sun and scavenging birds did their work. The man's flesh and eyes slowly rotted away, exposing his skull. This left him with empty eye sockets and a permanent, wide, skeletal grin where his lips had peeled back. For 10 long years, this wild camel had roamed the hills of Arizona, carrying the skeletal remains of this unknown rider. To anyone who saw them from a distance in the desert heat, it looked exactly like a terrifying, supernatural demon riding a red monster. Today, the story of the red ghost remains one of the most famous and bizarre pieces of folklore in the history of the American West. In fact, if you ever travel to the small town of Quartzsite, Arizona, you can find a permanent stone monument topped with a metal silhouette of a camel. It was built to honor the strange history of the U.S. Camel Corps and to remember the legend of the red ghost that once haunted the desert. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sure to imagine looking out your window and seeing the literal devil charging toward your house, riding a giant red monster with an eyeless, grinning skeletal face. In 1883, a terrified Arizona settler named Sarah watched this horrific beast sprint down a hill. Moments later, her sister was found violently trampled to death in the mud. For a decade, campers and cowboys reported encounters with this same red ghost, claiming a demonic, grinning figure was hunting humans in the desert night. In 1893, a farmer finally shot the monster down. When he approached the carcass, the supernatural legend completely shattered. The monster was actually a stray camel from a failed US military experiment. But the rider? It was a real human corpse, tightly lashed to the saddle, rotting under the desert sun. Who was this dead rider? Check the link in the comments.